Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Southeast Asia Dissemination and Discussion Forum for the 2023 Lancet series on breastfeeding, which was organized in collaboration with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and with the support of Alive and Thrive, UNICEF, the Lancet Regional Health Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, United Nations University, and Third World Network. This series was launched yesterday in London. I am Mira Sivisodi, and I will be taking you through today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2023 Lancet series comprises 3 papers that builds on the first series in 2016, this time with new evidence. Our panelists today will outline potential regional challenges, opportunities, and best practices related to the series findings and recommendations. There will be a 10-minute question and answer session towards the end of the program. So do send us your questions and we'll try and answer as many as possible. So to kickstart today's event, please allow me to introduce Dr. Sopapon Saditan, the Deputy Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health and ASEAN Senior Officials Meeting for Health Development from Laos People's Democratic Republic, for her welcome address. Dr. Sopapon.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished representatives, speakers, and participants. A pleasant day to all of you. It's very much appreciated and very much appreciate to welcome all of you to this seminar on the Southeast Asia Dissemination and Discussion Program for the Lancet 2023 on the breastfeeding. We all acknowledge the essential role of the young child in the health and nutritional status of the child. This has already been reflected in the high-level political commitments of the ASEAN with the declaration of form of the nutrition adopted by the ASEAN Summit in 2017. As part of the implementation of this declaration in the region, specific document on the ASEAN guidelines and minimum standards for protection, promotion, and support of the breastfeeding and feeding and the ASEAN guidelines, the minimum standards for action to protect children from the harmful impact of the markets of food and non-alcoholic beverage adopted by the ASEAN health sector in consultation with the ASEAN member states and development partners. These are also aligned with the implementation of the international code of the marketing of the bread meals strategy and all the related workings and restoration. Under the leader of the Ministry of Health, Laos, and the current chair of the ASEAN Senior Officer on Health Development and the ASEAN Health Minister meeting, continuous support is being provided with the ongoing contribution and sharing of experiences in providing more effective and integrated essential strategy and approach on the design, implementation, monitoring, and endorsement of the relevant strategy, relevant legislation policy, and the programs in the region. This bill further scale up and sustain with the multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholders encouragement through the implementation of the ASEAN Strategic Framework and Action Plan for the Nutrition 2018 to 2030. And next to the ASEAN Post 2015, Development Agenda 2021 to 2025, and is the faster work program. To further For sure, what we change and update based on what I can share. All of you will learn related matters from the speakers in this webinar. May this be pretty almost your learning session for all of us. I wish you a very useful and reproductive discussion. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sopapon. We apologize for the bad line, but we will learn more about the ASEAN initiatives that she was talking about in the presentation later on by Luz Dagunikar. That will be coming up next after our authors and presenters. Authors of the papers actually take us through the three papers. So ladies and gentlemen, the three papers make up the 2023 Lancet Breastfeeding series. The first on infant behaviors, feeding practices, and multi-sectoral interventions to support breastfeeding. The second paper on the commercial milk formula marketing playbook. And the third paper explores the power, political, and economic structures and their impact on infant feeding, health, and women's rights. So please welcome presenters and authors of the papers, Dr. Paul Zambrano, Regional Technical Associate Director of Alive and Thrive, East Asia Pacific, together with Chi Yok Ling, Executive Director of Third World Network.
Thank you, Mira, and thank you to our Som HD from Lao PDR for the introduction. Next slide, please. I want to first acknowledge the authors of the Lancet 2023 series on breastfeeding, 25 in total from 12 countries. And I also want to thank ASEAN and all our partners who helped organize this event. Now, infant feeding matters, and as part of that, breastfeeding is crucially important. In 2016, the first Lancet series on breastfeeding described just why that is so. For those who may not be so familiar, breastfeeding has a very significant influence on human systems biology that has lifelong impact on health and development. And it's true for infants, not just in low and middle income countries, but in high income settings as well. Breastfeeding affects maternal health and reduces the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. And at a simple, crude level, which is survival, the 2016 series estimated that if all children were breastfed according to WHO recommendations, then around 800,000 child deaths would be prevented every year. The current series came to be because over the past 20 years, despite this knowledge, infant feeding practices have changed. Globally, fewer than half of infants are fed according to WHO recommendations. Before we go into the series highlights, I want to make 2 points on terminology. We use the term commercial milk formula instead of the term more commonly used breast milk substitute. First, this is to highlight that commercial milk formula is artificial and ultra-processed, but also because the term substitute conveys the notion of equivalence. And the 2016 Lancet series shows the evidence that has strengthened our understanding and deepened our knowledge about how vastly different breast milk is from formula products. And second, to clarify what we mean by marketing. We refer to any form of commercial communication or activity that's designed or has the effect of increasing recognition, appeal, consumption of particular products. And this includes advertising, distribution, promotion, lobbying, and sponsorship. But it does not include the transportation or sale of the product itself. So this is not about removing formula milk from the shelves or restricting access to the product. This is all about the marketing practices. And there are 4 main messages that we distill out of the series. The first is that breastfeeding success is a collective responsibility. It is not the sole responsibility of women themselves or women alone. There are many externalities that constrain practices, and if we want to improve infant feeding, then we need both policy and societal responses to support individual women and families. The second thing this series does is to take a deep dive into infant behaviors. Like learning to walk or speak, sleeping and crying have normal trajectories, but these behavioral cues are easily misinterpreted or reframed. The third thing is that formula milk marketing influences our beliefs, our values, and our practices. It has negatively changed the infant feeding ecosystem. However, the extent of influence and both the power of marketing and the power to market has not been fully appreciated by those of us in health and civil society and government. Lastly, there are many constraints on women who decide to breastfeed, and it's the responsibility of government to implement structural interventions and policies to both support breastfeeding and also to mitigate the negative undermining influences. So we come to the first paper in the series. Breastfeeding is crucially important but increasingly challenged in a market-driven world. The paper starts with a conceptual framework that depicts the interactions ranging from the political and economic, and especially the mother and infant relationships and their impact on exclusive and continued breastfeeding. It documents how these interactions drive practices and what would be the policies and interventions to support breastfeeding. Like any paper published in the Lancet, it is supported by robust methods, analysis of nationally representative surveys, systematic reviews, and case studies. So now we go to some of the highlights from the papers. The first big message from paper 1 is about the late initiation of breastfeeding globally and the early introduction of prelacteal feeds. Prelacteal feeds is the giving of fluids such as water or formula milk before starting breastfeeding. We see on the figure on the left, the blue horizontal bars represent the proportion of infants initiating breastfeeding within the first hour of life as recommended by WHO. Less than half of newborns are put to breast within the first 60 minutes. These data come principally from low and middle income countries because we don't have good data from high income countries. But the probability is, even if with this data, that these numbers would be even worse. And on the figure on the right, we see in all income settings a clear correlation between the giving of any prelacteal feed and breastfeeding. Where you have higher rates of any prelacteal feed, the top left-hand corner, you have low rates of early initiation of breastfeeding on the x-axis. And this in turn is associated with shorter duration of breastfeeding and increased consumption of formula. As I mentioned earlier, Paper 1 examines infant behaviors in a way that few other publications have done. So the first thing to say is that human babies are born in an immature state. That's not a surprise to us, but they remain in that immature physiological and behavioral state for longer than just about any other primate. That means there's a significant process of post-birth maturation. So it takes time and support for young babies to learn to feed, to settle, and sleep. Sleep patterns of babies, as we all know, don't align with the patterns that we have as adults. Newborns express their discomfort through crying, and that signals the need for help and care. So crying is adaptive and it communicates many needs, not just hunger. The problem is that for parents who are tired and anxious themselves, it is a very difficult time to understand and read those cues well. I have 3 children and I relate to the statement completely. In a systematic review of reports from 22 countries in different income levels among healthy young infants, normal behaviors like regurgitation or crying are common. At least 50% of infants 0 to 3 months regurgitate once a day. And the average time that normal babies cry or that parents label them to be fussy is about 2 hours each day. This is understandably distressing for parents, but they are not abnormal. And consistently, this undermines parental self-efficacy. And so it's no surprise that women report how their infant's behavior shapes their assessment of their own milk supply, and how patterns of crying, fussiness, poor sleep undermine confidence. But it's not the mothers only, it's also the partners, family members, and health staff who potentially misinterpret these cues. In this analysis, self-reported insufficient milk, or SRIM, is the single most common reason given by 45% of mothers globally for first introducing formula milk in the first 6 months, and by 1/3 of mothers for actually stopping breastfeeding altogether. The irony is that the same evidence shows how effective counseling and support really does help parents understand these normal behaviors and improve breastfeeding practices. The flip side now is seeing how what is considered normal is being used as a marketing opportunity. New parents are legitimately concerned about those maturing baby behaviors, but maybe they are not understanding the cues completely. And we documented how marketing reframes these behaviors. The baby is crying too much, not sleeping because they are still hungry. And it presents these abnormal, pathologic, and it presents these normal behaviors as abnormal, pathological, or that mothers are somehow inadequate. Quote, if you're not sure whether you have enough milk, then maybe your baby needs formula. If your infant has a rash or cries or is unsettled, maybe they have an allergy. So these inferences and these innuendos are setting the stage for companies to then offer their products as solutions for, quote, peace of mind or certainty. And without skilled support and reassurance at these times, parents change from breastfeeding to formula milk or from one formula to another. What we see in a series of case studies, however, is that where countries make investments, they can improve exclusive breastfeeding rates. We see in these 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Mexico, the Philippines, and USA, a range of interventions that we know can influence the rates of breastfeeding. These interventions include the creation of mother support groups, landscape analysis to inform policy decisions, strong position statements from academics, extending paid maternity leave, and using data effectively to monitor and enforce the code can all result in improved rates. Now let's go to paper 2. Paper 2 is an examination of the marketing of formula products. The title is provocative, a system to capture parents, community, science, and policy, but we think it is justified. The objective of paper 2 is to describe the marketing playbook and its influence on people, families, health professionals, the scientific and policy-making world. Similar to the first paper, we employed multiple methods that we detailed more in the paper. And there are 3 major learning points from paper 2. The first is that marketing practices are multifaceted, they are sophisticated, and they are very well resourced. And because of that, they represent a powerful system of influence. It's not just a matter of some advertising here or a bit of lobbying there. Together, they come together to influence civil society, to influence health professionals, to influence policy and regulatory environments. And the system is made even more influential by digital systems. The marketing playbook for formula is not actually all that different from what we see in other products, like sports, shoes, athletic wear, food, and drink. What's different is that infant feeding has consequences for lifelong health and development, and marketing infringes the rights of children and families. They also represent a violation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. Formula milk is the only food product for which the UN World Health Assembly, the world's member states, expressed their collective will and put down on paper recommendations to limit its marketing. And lastly, marketing has worked and has been successful over decades to reshape individual, societal, and medical norms and values. As with paper 1, we started with the conceptual framework. And there's really one point that needs to be highlighted, and it's right in the middle. And that is everyone is a target of marketing strategies. Individuals, health professionals, governments, politicians, we are all targets. And the objective is to shape our values and beliefs and to alter our decisions. On the left are 2 figures. The bottom figure shows how sales per capita of all formula products are increasing. Note that these are not just the total sales over time for the past 15 years, but it's sales per capita, the kilograms sold per infant. And across all the 4 categories of commercial milk formula, standard, follow-on, growing up formula, and specialized formulas, they are all increasing. And that's why we can say that more infants than ever are receiving these products. The top figure also shows the relationship between breastfeeding rates and formula sales per capita, and the relationship is simple. Where you have higher sales of formula on the right of the x-axis, we see lower rates of breastfeeding at 12 months. And in 2019, these data translate into an annual sales of formula products to the tune of $55 billion US. Now, there are many reasons for these changes, including preference of families, work constraints of mothers, perceived insufficient milk, as described earlier, and poor support from health systems. But there is no doubt that marketing is a major influence as well. In our analysis of industry data, between 4 and 7% of annual sales are spent on marketing, and sometimes much more. That means for 2019, around $3.5 billion was spent by the industry on marketing. And we know that this astounding figure is an underestimate because this figure does not include the money spent on lobbying and social media and sponsorship of health professionals. And as I said, the title of paper 2 is provocative, but I will show you quotes from some of the 8,500 women in 8 countries who were interviewed about their experiences of marketing. Let's listen to their words and how they reflect marketing messages or suggestions. Let's listen to a mother in Mexico who said that all those scientific acronyms like DHA, you don't know what it is, but it sounds cool. It's supposed to be a nutrient that goes directly to the baby's brain. Let's listen to the mother in Vietnam who believed that if I want to promote brain development or height, then she would purchase a specific formula. Their beliefs have been captured. Let's listen to the mother in South Africa, the mother who liked the premium brand, the gold expensive look that conveys a sense of quality or that it was somehow unique, and for that product, she is willing to pay a premium price. Her values were captured. And a mother from London sharing how ads popped out seemingly out of nowhere. Cookies are being used by the industry to identify when women are pregnant and anchoring a strategy of targeted messages as early as this time, which highlights the process of capture. And we see the same joined-up strategy in packaging. These are just illustrative mock-ups of actual packaging. Industry invests in the science of communication and semiotics. Everything is deliberate. The colors used, the little scientific-looking emblems, the language of comfort, specially formulated for babies who are fussy, have colic, or crying, appealing to aspirations and parents' values, such as using words like great start or the gold color, using a baby with glasses who is going to be smarter. These messages and strategies are very deliberate. At a trade meeting in 2017, the CEO of one company said that infant nutrition wasn't necessarily about ingredients or innovation. What they were selling was sleep. Another panelist in the meeting said they were selling peace of mind, presumably to parents who had anxieties or specific hopes. Health workers are an important target. In marketing terms, they would be referred to as category entry points. If you're in the US or many countries and I say Serena Williams or Michael Jordan, maybe you think Nike. Or if I say the name of your football team, then you might think of the brand that sponsors that team, right? Health workers are important because in all regions, they are cited by families as being key informants about infant feeding. But sponsorship of health professionals, sponsoring their research, their guideline development are a means of influence, which most health professionals and associations believe they are somehow immune to, but constitute clear conflicts of interest. They are category entry points because, as we saw in the interviews of the 8,500 women, that if a health worker recommended a formula product, then the families are highly likely to follow that recommendation. The figure on the right of the echo chamber is part of a stakeholder mapping undertaken in South Africa by a marketing company on behalf of a major formula producer. You can see that they positioned the scientific and academic community at the center of this echo chamber. In fact, in the original document, there were even specific names of individuals because they know that if they can influence the scientific and academic leaders, then it influences their professional organizations, spreading to the broader health community and ultimately affecting consumer behavior. Lastly, we say that marketing captures policy and international recommendations. None of this is happening in a vacuum. International policy frameworks are being manipulated to decrease their effectiveness. And we see this in systematic reviews, the case studies, and analysis of public access information. The International Code of Breast Milk Substitutes, agreed by World Health Assembly, It's in different ways blocked, reinterpreted, circumvented, or ignored, even in countries that have adopted them in a way that's substantially aligned with the original code. The Codex Alimentarius is another critical international regulatory framework that has been established to protect consumer health. But the evidence is clear how it is manipulated by industry to establish weaker standards. In its marketing, industry capitalizes on the lack of implementation of maternity leave that enables breastfeeding. And we see the effect of lobby groups as they influence policy environments and shift things in favor of shareholder interest. To be clear, marketing is not inherently bad, nor are these conclusions anti-profit. What we have pieced together is a more complete picture of marketing than just advertising or occasional sponsorship of health workers. And we see the effects on policy investment, and regulatory bodies. In particular, I want to highlight that a criticism of industry and its marketing is not a criticism of women, their decisions, or circumstance, nor is it about trying to remove formula products from the market. What we see is that industry deploys a system that is strategic, deliberate, very well resourced to turn the birth of an infant and the care of parents into a business opportunity. This undermines breastfeeding and human rights and should not be allowed to continue. I now hand over to Yokling, who will run us through paper 3 and our overall series recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. As we can see, paper 3 actually continues from paper 2 that goes into the structural aspects, and we will be looking at the political economy analysis, and the framework we will use is in the next slide. At the top in gray, we have the tension between breastfeeding and commercial feeding and its direct impact on health on the one hand, and the indirect impact on health, which will comprise social, economic, and environmental outcomes. At the bottom in the blue box, we have the political, economic, social, and technological structures of society, and this includes its institutions, its dominant ideas and beliefs, and the distribution of power and resources across society. This determines, of course, who make decisions and who has the final call. These are upstream or basic determinants, as they are called. And they are linked to feeding practices and outcomes by looking at how they influence in 3 areas or domains: the domain of society, labeled in the yellow box. And then you have the domain, the first is commerce, where we described the power of marketing, as we heard in paper 2. And then we look at the industry's power to market in this paper 3. The second domain on care and work focuses on the gendered power systems in society and how society values or does not value breastfeeding. Finally, and crucially, we look at the agency, mandates, interests, and capabilities of different actors in both shaping and being shaped by the factors in the blue box, and the actions and policies and impacts across all the 3 domains of commerce, care and work, and health. The next slide. As with papers 1 and 2 that Paul had highlighted, this paper 3 also draws on extensive literature and on primary research that's been published elsewhere. And so let's begin with the first domain, which is on commerce. The staggering growth of formula sales was described by Paul as he spoke just now. What's also important to understand is these markets are highly concentrated. So we see, for example, 6 companies control over 60% of the global market. And we have listed them here: Abbott, Danone, Friesland Campina, Nestle, and Reckitt, which includes Mead Johnson with some mergers. And then the research also points that they have profit margins that exceeds 20%. This is enormous. So these features of the market, concentration and high profit margins, show that they have enormous economic power, these companies, over decision-making. Indeed, collectively, the 4 companies, the 4 biggest companies, generate revenues that are greater than the GDP of all the countries in the world except for 61. This is really mind-boggling. So these 4 companies own assets that are more than the private wealth held in every African country except for South Africa. And the workforce that they command actually is bigger than the combined health workforce of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. And here we're not even counting the employees of the advertising companies, the legal firms, and the professional lobby groups hired by these companies at the national level and also internationally. So understanding the economic power of the industry is crucial, not just because it underpins the marketing power of these companies, but because it also underpins a powerful and sophisticated political strategy. This was alluded to in paper 2. This is not something that is ad hoc or accidental. It is very deliberate and planned. So this includes, for example, what seems to be benevolent and public-facing corporate social responsibility activities that are aimed at getting social legitimacy, capital, corporate washing, as we commonly call it. And on top of all that, the more public face of this kind of PR, we also have a lot of covert action that are aimed at co-opting opponents and undermining the implementation of the International Code on Marketing, which is 50 years old and yet not fully implemented because of these forces. As we see from paper 2, scientists and academics are a very, very key part of this covert action. So much of this is actually carried out by extensive international and national lobbying networks. They include a variety of industry-funded front groups, as well as food, beverage, and grocery manufacturer associations and the dairy industry. So this is really a broad network. So efforts to frustrate and curtail the regulation of marketing are also supported by industry, especially in international trade forums and at the Codex Alimentarius that Paul referred to, which is an international standard setting body, which is unduly influenced by industry representation. And these are also then influencing the formula and dairy producing states, notably the US, EU, Australia, and New Zealand. And you see these national, so-called national positions are very aligned to industry positions. We also in this paper describe the commercial milk formula industry involvement in alliances across industry and across sectors so that they can further their corporate interests in general. So there is a general corporate capture going on across all sectors. So there's a lot of cooperation and collusion across sectors of different industries. And this include, what do? They lobby the US government particularly, for example, to defund the World Health Organization, at the same time undermining the WHO's public health mandate and scientific credentials. Even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we saw this happening. Then if the economic and political power of formula companies compared to governments, public health agencies, and mothers and children, if this is a problem, then we have to understand, why is this a problem? How did these companies become so powerful and influential? We have to understand so that we can then curtail and push back on this corporate capture. So globalization and integration of markets and supply chains is part of the story of transnational corporate growth. And this is enhanced actually by very neoliberal policy approaches. And what are these neoliberal policy approaches? They include giving deregulation, the privilege. Deregulation is seen as a positive, but deregulation at the expense of public health. And there's also commodification and marketizing more and more aspects of life, including the care of children. And then expanding the power of finance capital and the drive to extract profits in ever more aggressive ways. And so this is something that we see a lot, and the public has been made quite aware in the pharmaceutical industry, but actually it's the same pattern and forces at work in this industry. The other aspect, of course, is tax. International tax competition, tax avoidance, and abuse of tax rules, coupled with ineffective antitrust measures. These are to have competition rules in the country. So mostly ineffective in most countries, or don't exist in many developing countries. All this have shifted also power and resources away from people, away from parliaments of elected representatives, away from regulatory bodies and public services, towards transnational corporate and financial actors. Finally, formula companies are aided by the fact that the costs of not breastfeeding are externalized and paid for others. So for example, health associated costs, which we are familiar with when we do not have breastfeeding for children. Also the cost of considerable environmental damage from plastic bottles and formula packaging, and the additional greenhouse gas emissions involved in milk production of industrial scale, and the manufacture and transportation of formula across the world. So these are the costs that are not taken into account and therefore does not reflect the true cost. And we also show in the paper 3 how the increasing profits of industry, the blue line in the graph, is accompanied at the same time by a trend of declining tax rates, the red line. So you can see the margin of profit is just growing phenomenally. And what happens is that because much of these profits end up in high-income countries, while the harms are disproportionately burdening people in low and middle-income countries, the industry can also be characterized as being neo-colonial and one that undermines sustainable development and worsens inequality across the world. Let's move to the second domain, the domain of women, care, and work. Across the world, households are increasingly forced to live in systems that devalue or undervalue the time required to provide proper care to infants and young children. Care work in general is central to human survival and flourishing, mostly done by women, but is ignored by mainstream economic and accounting, despite the value of unpaid care work that has been estimated to be equivalent to 20 to 40% of GDP. This is really, really enormous. Similarly, breastfeeding is rarely included in official food production accounts, despite the monetary value of women's milk production globally that's also been estimated, and this comes to about $3.6 trillion. This treatment of breastfeeding as a free or costless activity or as a lifestyle choice, while commercial formula is counted as meaningful for production, included in GDP calculations. This is perverse and nonsensical and actually represents a structural fault line that we see very clearly in this paper series. And this undermines, what does it mean? What happens? It undermines breastfeeding and fosters a dependency on formula, and it helps to divest governments of their responsibilities for safeguarding the rights of children and women. Indeed, the coverage of maternity rights protection and the provision of breastfeeding support in the workplace remains dismal and inadequate, as we've seen from the other papers, especially paper 1. This makes it difficult or impossible for millions of women to breastfeed, a problem only made worse by the rising levels of women working in precarious and underpaid work in both the formal and the informal sectors. Finally, we come to the health domain, where we raise 3 interconnected issues. First, the paper 3 highlights the problem of patriarchal and biomedical cultures. This hinder culturally sensitive and women-centered maternity care. They encourage intrusive and interventionist obstetric practices that undermine breastfeeding, and they contribute to the unacceptable lack of attention to breastfeeding in the core curriculum of health professional training. Second, we note the rise and normalization of private-public partnerships and the increasing commercialization and privatization of health systems as trends that foster a more unquestioning acceptance of industry influence over health education, health research, and clinical guidelines, despite clear conflicts of interest that was shown very clearly in paper 2. Finally, we identify inadequate public budgets that leave health systems under-resourced as a major structural barrier to breastfeeding. And we argue that greater amounts of public finance and investment can be generated responsibly without causing economic instability. And this echoes conclusions made by the WHO's Council on the Economics of Health for All. And the 4 country case studies that we see in the other paper actually reinforces the need for public investment. So this is paper 3. As we have seen, we've covered a lot in this series of 3 papers. Each paper has its own set of recommendations, but I will end by presenting 6 cross-cutting recommendations as a whole across the 3 papers. First, parents, health professionals, and society more broadly must be given correct information about infant behavior and breastfeeding and the support needed to breastfeed. Second, there must be stricter regulation of marketing. Indeed, we call for an end to the commercial marketing of all food products for children while strengthening the implementation of the WHO Code on Marketing. It's 50 years old. It's been voluntary. It's time for something stronger and necessary. Third, we think that everyone should have a more complete understanding of the industry as a whole, including about the sophistication of its political and marketing strategies and its broader social, economic, and environmental negative impacts. Fourth, we know that baby-friendly, women-centered, and culturally appropriate maternity care will improve breastfeeding rates. So proper investment in a trained and empowered workforce and stronger codes of conduct to eliminate conflicts of interest is a must. Fifth, it's unacceptable that so much of the work and responsibility for breastfeeding is left on the shoulders of mothers and women. The value of care work must be incorporated into economic accounting systems and policies. The unbalanced gender distribution of care work must be corrected, and investment in maternity protection and baby-friendly work environments must be prioritized. But finally, unless the imbalance in power between the private actors with an interest, a deep interest, profitable interest in expanding formula consumption, and those with a duty and a mandate to protect the rights of children and women, unless this imbalance of power is corrected, little will change. So shifting power to correct this imbalance, injustice, is ambitious, we know, and may be considered utopian. But by working across multiple policy areas through broader multidisciplinary coalitions, we believe it is possible that this can be a global effort from the ground to the international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul and Yokling, for your presentation of just a sort of a summary of the 3 papers and the recommendations. Despite the challenges outlined in this paper, in these papers, some ASEAN, for an example, has been committed, and we do have a question about whether or not, how do you manage digital marketing, right? So that question, I think, will be answered during Zoom's presentation about Vietnam. Vietnam has actually successfully implemented measures to curb abuse or unethical marketing on the digital platform. So moving along, breastfeeding has had the strong support and commitment of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and outlining the ASEAN health sector initiatives on nutrition. One of the initiative is the development of ASEAN guidelines and minimum standards for the protection, promotion, and support of breastfeeding and complementary feeding. So please welcome Luz Tagunica. She's the Supervising Health Program Officer, Division Disease Prevention and Control Bureau from the Department of Health, Philippines. Luz, over to you.
Distinguished guests and participants, good morning. Today, the ASEAN Health Sector I will present the ASEAN Health Sector initiatives on nutrition, particularly the development of guidelines and minimum standards for the protection, promotion, and support of breastfeeding and complementary feeding, including the implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and relevant World Health Assembly resolutions. Next slide, please. As a background, in 2017, ASEAN leaders agree on the urgent need to accelerate evidence-based multi-sectoral actions and scale up interventions to reduce and ultimately end all forms of malnutrition, particularly among the most vulnerable, which are the poor and disadvantaged groups of ASEAN. This led to the ASEAN leaders' declaration in ending all forms of malnutrition, which was adopted during the 31st ASEAN Summit as their high-level political commitment. The declaration was the region's response to the findings contained in the ASEAN Regional Report on Nutrition Security 2016 and to the recommendations of the ASEAN Multi-Sectoral Collaborative Workshop on Nutrition Security involving health, nutrition, food and agriculture, and social welfare sectors in 2017. Next slide, please. To operationalize the declaration, the ASEAN Strategic Framework and Action Plan for Nutrition 2018 to 2030 was formulated and adopted by the ASEAN Health Ministers in 2019. This framework and action plan has 5 strategic thrusts, which includes regional project activities, which was developed through a multi-sectoral consultation involving the sectors of health, food and agriculture, education, and social welfare and development. These sectors have also endorsed nutrition-specific and nutrition-sensitive regional activities in this framework and action plan. Next slide, please. Relevant to this webinar, one of the guidelines and minimum standards that was developed under the implementation of ASEAN Strategic Framework and Action Plan for Nutrition is the ASEAN Guidelines and Minimum Standards for the Protection, Promotion, and Support of Breastfeeding and Complementary Feeding, including the implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and relevant World Health Assembly resolutions, led by the Philippines and co-led by Malaysia, with support from UNICEF and the Alive and Thrive. These ASEAN minimum standards was developed because the infant and young child feeding practices and nutritional status of children under 5 years varies across ASEAN countries. Overall, the data show that the child malnutrition is a serious concern for all ASEAN member states and that very few children in the ASEAN region are receiving optimal diets and breast milk during the first 2 years of life. In ASEAN, there has been progress in implementing the code through the robust national legislation. However, only some ASEAN member states have enacted legal measures with provisions for implementing the code. Next slide, please. The guidelines and minimum standards is structured in 8 sections to guide the user on essential strategies, interventions, and approaches that countries should include at the minimum for the essential minimum standard in a comprehensive and robust infant and young child feeding strategy, policies, programs, and interventions to improve IYCF practices from birth up to age 2 years old in ASEAN. Policy support entails political or strategic support for appropriate IYCF practices, as well as specific support at the sectoral and implementation levels. Policies need to support facility and community level strategies, social and behavior change, and health worker training. They must also protect, promote, and support breastfeeding by restricting the marketing of breast milk substitutes through implementation and enforcement of the code and by providing maternity leave. The purpose of this document is to guide countries on how to protect and promote child diets and feeding practices through specific policies, actions, interventions, and nutrition services that support optimal IYCF practices and to improve implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions in ASEAN member states. The intended audience are the health, nutrition, and other relevant sectoral staff in ASEAN member states, governments, program managers, and planners. This document should guide government staff and program managers on essential strategies, interventions, and approaches as they seek to design, implement, modify, and monitor the minimum set of infant and young child feeding policies, programs, and interventions. This guidance document should be used alongside other ASEAN guideline documents that have complementary sections like the integrated management of acute malnutrition, marketing of food and beverage to children, and with reference to the global resources and guidelines that provide more in-depth information on specific elements. The guidance is applicable at national and subnational levels, but has been written with a national focus. For countries with decentralized health systems like the Philippines, the guidance and minimum standards can be equally applied to more local level planning. Next slide, please. The draft ASEAN guidelines and minimum standards was developed through consultation with all ASEAN member states. The guidelines has been adopted by the ASEAN health ministers in December 2021 and launched at the side event of the 15th ASEAN Health Ministers meeting in May 2022. There was also a panel discussion conducted in April 22, participated by ASEAN member states, UNICEF, Alive and Thrive, to discuss the utilization of these guidelines in the future, including use at the national level, its complementarity with other nutrition-related guidelines, as well as strategies to address challenges in the implementation. Next slide, please. The International Code Document Center, in consultation with international legal experts, has promoted the use of a model law to give effect to the code and subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions. Recognizing that the code and the World Health Assembly resolutions form a minimum standard, the model law is intended to serve as a comprehensive legal resource and template that can be adapted to the needs of a country's legislative system. Its overarching goal is to ensure safe and adequate nutrition for infants and young children by protecting breastfeeding and by regulating the marketing of breast milk substitutes, feeding bottles, teats, pacifiers, and foods for infants and young children. The model law represents a recommended standard and is a useful tool for lawmakers. It contains model language that can be used to give legal effect to the provisions of the code and is included in its entirety in the appendix of the ASEAN guidelines. Implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and subsequent relevant World Health Assembly resolutions through the enactment and enforcement of robust national legal measures is essential to ensuring that parents and other caregivers are protected from inappropriate and misleading information. Implementation also ensures that health workers, their professional associations, and health facilities do not promote breast milk substitute or accept support from the manufacturers or distributors of breast milk substitutes, feeding bottles, or teats. Next slide, please. Aligned with the 2016 WHO guidance on ending the inappropriate promotion of foods for infants and young children, regulating the inappropriate promotion of commercially produced foods and beverages marketed for feeding children aged 6 to 36 months is an essential action for all ASEAN member states. The 2016 WHO guidance defines promotion as the communication of messages that are designed to persuade or encourage the purchase or consumption of a product or raise awareness of a brand. This includes advertising activities and materials, non-advertising promotions such as special displays, sales, discount coupons and rebates, and labeling, packaging, and claims. Next slide, please. Another relevant guidelines, which is a work in progress, is the ASEAN Guidelines and Minimum Standards on Actions to Protect Children from the Harmful Impact of Marketing of Food and Non-Alcoholic Beverages, led by Thailand and co-led by Singapore and the Philippines. It is also with support from UNICEF, World Health Organization, and Alive and Thrive. The guidelines document has been finalized as in the process to be adopted by the ASEAN health ministers, but we are pleased to share information on this initiative this early to show that the region indeed recognizes the issue of unhealthy food marketing and is taking steps to provide member states with evidence-based guidance covering the many facets of marketing. This is linked to another ongoing initiative of the ASEAN Health Cluster, the minimum standards and guidelines on actions to protect children from the harmful impact of marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages. So next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luz. That's good work that's being done in the Philippines. We have some questions, but we'll answer them during the Q&A session. Once again, if you have questions, just type them into the chat box and we'll be happy to answer them during the session later. So the second paper of the Lancet Breastfeeding Series 2023, it explores the commercial milk formula marketing playbook. And given that digital marketing has become a sophisticated machine, unethical advertising of commercial milk formula has been even more targeted. So sharing Vietnam's innovation in monitoring digital marketing of commercial milk formula and other unhealthy foods, it is our pleasure to introduce Dung Vu, Chair of Scaling Up Nutrition Civil Society, Alliance Vietnam, and FHI Solutions Innovation Incubator. Dung?
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. So on behalf of the Scaling Up Nutrition Civil Society Alliance Vietnam and APHI 360 APHI Solutions, I'd like to present today about the Vietnam innovation in monitoring the harmful digital marketing of the commercial milk formula in Vietnam. Next slide, please. So I believe that these days, ChatGPT, OpenAI is dominating all the headlines in the world. So today I'm very honored to share the Vietnam experience in collaborating with the government of Vietnam to apply artificial intelligence, but for ethical purpose. That is to prevent or protect the children and families from harmful marketing of unhealthy food. So to give you some background, Vietnam has a total population of 100 million people, and we are among the top 15 countries with smartphone users. And we are ranked Facebook's 7th largest user base with an estimated of 58 million active users. Online ads industry is also growing rapidly, reaching about 390 million US dollars, and it tripled in 4 years. So since 2014, the social networks in Vietnam actually overtook the search engines to become the most used online advertising method in Vietnam. Next slide. Therefore, although Vietnam has adopted a comprehensive legal framework to prevent aggressive marketing of unhealthy food, like the law on advertisement, law on prevention of tobacco, law on prevention of alcohol harm, and Decree 100, that is the National Code of Vietnam. However, with the growing digital economy, the online advertisement violations are still rampant. Next slide. And therefore, most recently in 2020, the government of Vietnam adopted the first ever regulations on digital marketing. That is, according to this regulation, online platforms will have to report annually on advertisement violations, and they have to remove the violations within 24 hours upon report. So the Ministry of Information and Comms disseminated this regulation to companies, and since 2022, after 1 year of implementation, the Ministry of Information and Comms have sanctioned 15 companies with a total penalty of $10,000. And one company also applied voluntary filter to block online ads violations upon the government request. And so far, 2,000 online ads related to drugs, functional food, and gambling have been removed. Next slide. So here are some of the pictures of the online ads that have been removed upon the report to the government of Vietnam. And now I'd like to introduce you to the Vivid. Next slide. It is a virtual violations detector that is an application using the supervised machine learning to automatically detect the online ads violations. This is to explain how Vivid works. You know that as the government of Vietnam is moving towards the e-government, they would like to make sure that every government officers will have a virtual assistant that can help them with the administration work and also with the monitoring the digital advertisements. With only 2 health inspectors in charge of the tobacco, alcoholic beverages, and commercial milk formula advertisements, I believe that they cannot screen thousands of online advertisements every day, and therefore the support of Vivid or the virtual assistant to detect or to automatically scan the online advertisement and detect the violations is very important. The algorithm behind it is that would teach the Vivid with samples of pictures, about 10,000 pictures of violations, and classify them into different types of violations. And then Vivid will learn from image detection and text recognition, and then it will automatically crawl the data from the fan page websites, and then identify whether they violate or not the code. Then we use supervised machine learning, meaning that there will be a supervisors who are from the NGOs and also the government to confirm vivid detection, whether it is correct or not. And based on this correction, vivid will also, it will create a learning loop for vivid and improve its accuracy over time. Next slide. So since 2021, the vivid has started detecting the violations of advertisement related to commercial milk formula. And since last year, 2022, vivid expanded to detect violations related to alcoholic beverages and tobacco. And in last year only, about 4,000 commercial milk formula acts violations were detected, 500 tobacco acts, and 300 alcoholic beverages acts were detected. And as you can see on the screen, that is the graph of all the breast milks of the commercial milk formula companies and and the number of violations that detected by vivid over the last year. So key recommendation and takes away, and that is the important role of the civil society together with the government to apply the technology and artificial intelligence to detect the violations on the digital platform. But we also look forward to the ASEAN code monitoring framework and also legal framework that can legalize such tools so that it will become applicable to all the routine work of the government officials, not only in Vietnam, but also other countries. And for your information, vivid is now not only limited to Vietnam, but it has also expanded to scan the violations in the English-speaking countries of Philippines, Singapore, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Over to you, and I look forward to the fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Zoe. That's excellent work going on in Vietnam. Thank you. Moving on to the third part of our discussion, breastfeeding we know is not the sole responsibility of women, but it's society's collective responsibility. I think we need to shift that narrative a little. It should be protected, it should be promoted, and it must be supported. There are questions already on how to empower breastfeeding support groups, who are predominantly made up of mothers who have a million other things to do. So we'll address that question during the Q&A session. But do welcome Dr. Julie Smith, Honorary Associate Professor at the Australian National University. She's going to be speaking about the care economy, its relevance to breastfeeding, infant and young child nutrition, as well as women's nutrition. Julie, over to you.
Thank you, Mira. Gendered power systems shape breastfeeding patterns by influencing the visibility of women's productivity and their access to economic resources of time and money, while fostering dependence on commercial milk formula. So I have been delighted that I've been asked today to elaborate today on the topic, the care economy and its relevance to breastfeeding, infant and young child nutrition, and women's nutrition. So what is the care economy? And why is unpaid care work undervalued? What is the impact on women? And how does it relate to marketing? I will also share with you some resources that can support advocacy efforts and some actionable recommendations. The definition of care work comes from the International Labour Organization. Fulfill the physical, physiological, psychological and emotional needs of all humans, young children, older people, people living with disabilities and people who are sick or ill. Caring activities can be direct, for example, infant and young child feeding or nursing a person who is sick, or indirect, for example, cleaning, cooking or collecting water. Why is unpaid care work undervalued? So we've heard about the broad context for infant and young child feeding, the ideas, the institutions and the resources which influence rewards, and the differential power of the key actors to shape those rewards. And we've heard that care work, including breastfeeding, is ignored by mainstream economic accounting. Why is this? Well, international rules for measuring the economy, United Nations System of National Accounting, the SNA, were developed by the US, the UK, and other European countries in the 1950s. Production is only counted if there is a monetary exchange. This system counts commercial milk formula breastfeeding breast milk. The SNA and its core component, GDP, gross, has become the way economic performance and progress is measured. This economic institution has shaped social norms and beliefs about what is economically important. Its outdated and gender-biased ideas and measurement practices serve to perpetuate the invisibility and undervaluation of women's productivity. GDP has long been criticised by feminists as a measure of the economy. Marilyn Waring is the most famous of these. The SNA economic measurement system depletes women through hiding the unequal sharing of overall work burdens. Unpaid work is not the same thing as leisure. In China, for example, women's total work time averages 7 to 11 hours more per week than men. Time use survey data from 64 countries show that women perform 3/4 of all unpaid care work. This adds to their work burdens, time poverty, stress levels, and opportunities for recreation. We can measure and value this non-market activity with time use data. Time can be equated to money. Time use data for OECD countries shows that unpaid work has a monetary value that is at least 40 to 50% the size of GDP in those countries. As we explain in the Lancet paper, failure to recognise care work in economic statistics generates gender inequality and misleads policymakers and distorts fiscal priorities. Economic statistics which exclude human milk wrongly imply that producing it is unimportant for the economy. When breastfeeding declines and formula sales rise, this is measured as GDP going up. Statistics matter because they are the evidence on which policy is built and budgets are allocated. The OECD has found that GDP growth significantly overstates economic performance because marketisation of economic activity during economic development is often just replacing what was previously done by women with payment for and measuring that work. Reform to the system is long overdue. The influential Stiglitz-Sen Commission has been reviewing how economic progress should be measured and has concluded that there is a serious omission in the valuation of home-produced goods, the value of breast milk. They say this is clearly within the system of national accounts production boundary, is quantitatively non-trivial, and also has important implications for public policy and child and maternal health. It is clear that even under the existing rules, then, all breast milk production should be counted in GDP. Breast milk production isn't counted in international and national food monitoring systems either, except in Norway. Using the same methods as in Norway, I estimated that the annual volume of milk produced by women for infants and young children of 0 to 24 months in low and middle income countries was around 23 billion litres in 2010. The omission of this food production means that women's economic contributions go unnoticed. This problem also leads to further problems in action. Money is the language of policy makers. The protection, promotion and support for other producers, commercial producers of foods and feeding practices, including cow's milk products and commercial milk formulas for infants and toddlers. Investing in these is likely to have a lower rate of return to society than investing in breastfeeding. If the monetary value of breast milk was more visible, greater funding priority might be given to programs which expand human milk production by increasing breastfeeding, such as implementing the baby-friendly hospital initiative and the international code, financing access to peer counsellors or health professional lactation support, or to introducing better paid maternity leave and requiring breastfeeding accommodations in workplaces. So the Mother's Milk tool. The value of breastfeeding is far beyond its monetary aspects, but data, knowledge and visibility of its economic value can better acknowledge women's unique contribution and can inform public policy and emphasise the importance of listening. We developed a tool. The Mother's Milk tool advances methodologies, generates evidence and supports strategic communication for policy advocacy. It's user-friendly and downloadable. The Mother's Milk tool calculates that 36 billion litres a year, approximately, is produced by the world's mothers, packaged sustainably and packaged along with nurturing care. The tool estimates that the global monetary value of women's milk production for infants and young children 0 to 36 months was around $3.6 trillion as mentioned previously. So what happens if this invisible production is lost because of overriding profit incentives in the marketised, globalised food system? Current production of human milk is only around 38% of its potential levels if all women were supported to breastfeed, and that lost milk is around 22 billion litres a year. At a monetary value of around $100 a litre, we're losing over $2.2 trillion a year worth of this uniquely valuable food. So the tool is useful for many purposes, as you can see here: food nutrition security advocates, researchers, national accountants, and economists for their decision-making and programming, as well as by mothers, families, and their caregivers to enjoy evidence and visibility for their work. The Mother's Milk tool is the logical counterpart to the cost of not breastfeeding tool, which has been developed by Alive and Thrive to identify costs to health systems and people from premature cessation of breastfeeding. The Mother's Milk tool also complements IBFAN's WBCI costing tool for estimating the financing needs for breastfeeding, including maternity entitlements. Inadequate maternity rights protection and poor working condition make it difficult or impossible for a vast number of mothers to breastfeed. To breastfeed or formula feed is not a real choice if breastfeeding means mothers and families must forego employment and secure livelihoods. Low wages and excessive work hours may also affect how unpaid work burdens are distributed between men and women within families. Time pressure of infant care is time consuming. In my Australian time use study of 156 new mothers, having a baby added 40 to 48 hours of extra unpaid work hours a week, including nighttime parenting. The lactating mothers interacted more with the infant, responding to baby's cues. This responsive feeding and nurturing care is important for children to thrive. You can learn more about this study in published papers. Regardless of how the baby was fed, the mothers got only a few minutes a week help from fathers with care of the infant. Exclusive breastfeeding took around 18 hours a week, 6 hours more than if solids or formula were introduced. However, after accounting for food preparation and complementary feeding, the time difference was not substantial or significant statistically. All new mothers in this study had less sleep, more interrupted sleep, and less time for necessary personal care, leisure and recreation compared to adult norms, regardless of feeding method. There were not significant differences in free or sleep time except for exclusive breastfeeding of young babies. In that case, and spending less time in employment or housework. So overburdened mothers are vulnerable to marketing. In Advice on Marketing Trends in 2013, Euromonitor International concluded that with an increasing number of mothers returning to work after giving birth, products that help babies sleep better could have wide appeal. This product misleadingly claims to do that. As paper 2 in the Lancet series shows, company marketing misconstrues normal infant behaviour and misleadingly sells sleep to exhausted mothers. This helps us understand that governments that do not provide adequate maternity entitlements are protecting milk formula sales, not protecting breastfeeding. 50 years ago, World Bank nutritionist Alan Berg remarked on the invisible losses of a valuable national resource. He talked about the poor countries of the world, but the crisis in infant feeding is a global one and it is ongoing. He said, an unusual depletion in the crude oil reserves of an oil-producing country of Asia or Latin America would be termed a crisis. Its economic and social implications would be so catastrophic, yet a comparable crisis involving values of dollars is going virtually unnoticed in many of the poor countries of the world. The resource is human milk, and the loss is by the dramatic and steady of maternal nursing in recent decades.
Right, Julie, your slides are going far ahead of your presentation. We're on the thank you slide. You just want to go back to the one that you're presenting?
Yes, please.
Is this the right one? Reforms to GDP and economic accounting?
No, before that.
Unusual depletion in the crude oil reserves?
Oh, okay. Well, I've just finished that. So the next one, yes.
Okay.
So as we talk about in Lancet paper 3, gender responsive budgeting is a useful strategy for assessing how government's fiscal. The gender budgeting approach scrutinises the divergent effects on men and women of government budget to account for unpaid work. Despite powerful calls to invest in breastfeeding, governments rarely allocate necessary budgets. Instead, they fund superficial campaigns to promote breast is best. These substitute for the more difficult and costly measures addressing the broader sociocultural, economic and commercial determinants of breastfeeding that we've talked about. A major ILO study found that addressing these care policy gaps, such as maternity leave and breastfeeding breaks, would have a global cost in 2030 of US $269 billion, which is just 1/4 of 1% of GDP. This is feasible and affordable in all country settings. So there are widening calls for transformative investments in the care economy in response to an escalating global crisis of care. As well as gender responsive budgeting, the key areas for action in relation to care and work are in relation to GDP and economic accounting, maternity protections, and ending exploitative marketing and paid workforce participation to increase GDP growth without accounting for these invisible unpaid work burdens risks exacerbating gender inequity while undermining breastfeeding. The huge expansion of global formula sales demonstrated in the Lancet series does not indicate economic progress. Instead, it measures our society's failure to provide fair and equal resources for women and children, and to measure the large public health and other costs of not breastfeeding. Making care work and mother's milk visible in economic statistics and food balance sheets would help raise the policy priority for investing in breastfeeding and redistributing the burdens of this crucial care work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That's really good work. I think there have been requests for the mother's milk too, because everybody wants to find out a little bit more about it. But thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, instrumental to the breastfeeding series and the papers was UNICEF. UNICEF has been a staunch supporter of the code since its adoption more than 40 years ago, and has supported countless countries with its implementation. So Dr. Roland Kupka, UNICEF Regional Nutrition Advisor for East Asia and Pacific, reflects on the relevance of the findings of the series for Southeast Asia. Roland?
Hello, colleagues, distinguished participants. It's a real pleasure to be with you today during this dissemination and discussion forum for the Lancet 2023 series on breastfeeding. As we've heard, the series puts a spotlight on the most egregious form of unethical marketing in the form of the aggressive promotion of commercial milk formula for babies and young children. This type of marketing is even more egregious because it further exploits the challenges of our times, in that it capitalizes on fears created during the COVID pandemic and further entrenches economic hardship by promoting the purchase of expensive and unnecessary commercial milk formulas among vulnerable households who are grappling with rising food and fuel costs. Thanks to the work performed as part of the series and coupled with last year's report on how the marketing of formula milk influences our decisions on infant feeding, we now have up-to-date and comprehensive documentation on how formula milk marketing disrupts informed decision-making and undermines breastfeeding and child health. Without a doubt, this evidence is particularly relevant for us here in the Southeast Asia region, where far too few children benefit from the full benefits of breastfeeding. Indeed, our data shows that only 4 out of 10 infants from this region start breastfeeding within the first hour of life and are exclusively breastfed for the recommended first 6 months. It is also well known that while most countries have enacted at least some provisions of the code in national laws and regulations in this region, gaps and loopholes often remain in the legislation, allowing violations of the code to persist. In addition, and as we've heard, most countries in the region do not have active systems to monitor marketing practices of commercial milk formula, identify violations, and enforce meaningful sanctions. As a result, it is really disheartening when walking through the cities of Southeast Asia and at times even rural parts to see how commercial milk formulas on sale far too often and often blatantly violate the code. It is also disheartening to browse through popular internet platforms in the region, as it is so clear that the digital
Roland, are you there? Roland?
loopholes in legislation, innovations in our monitoring, and commitment to enforcement. Now, luckily, we do see many promising developments in this regard in this region. We have already heard about the groundbreaking work used in Vietnam to monitor digital marketing of commercial milk formula. In Vietnam, efforts are also ongoing to link health insurance reimbursement mechanisms for hospitals.
I think we've lost Roland. We'll try and get Roland back after this. Am I correct? Okay, we'll move on. Just building on the care economy as well. Brunei Darussalam has actively taken steps to support breastfeeding mothers in the workplace and in the provision of childcare. So let me invite Dr. Rafida Garif, Director of Health Services and Head of Primary Care Services, Ministry of Health, Brunei Darussalam, where she will share the Brunei experience for the possible consideration in other ASEAN member states. Dr. Rafida?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I would like to, on behalf of Brunei Darussalam, we would like to thank the invitations to join to be discussed in this forum. Brunei Darussalam actually as a government is very serious in taking the breastfeeding initiatives as a nation. And in 2001, in line with the WHO UNICEF recommendation, we have introduced our national breastfeeding policy as part of our endeavor to protect, support, and promote the practice of exclusive breastfeeding amongst women. Hence, a MySIN task force was formally established. And the ball started rolling in 1999, and up to now, we are still constantly monitoring our exclusive breastfeeding rate within the country. And as part of the commitment as well, the Ministry of Health has used the KPI for exclusive breastfeeding as our annual KPI for one of the annual KPI for the Ministry of Health to be submitted to our Ministry of Finance and Economy for our annual budgeting. Although we know that the breastfeeding initiatives and the success is not just for Ministry of Health, but it's a whole nation's approach. Hence, for exclusive breastfeeding in Brunei, from our first enhance in the 1995s, we found that only about 6% of mothers are exclusively breastfeeding beyond 5 months of the baby's age. However, in 2011, we introduced a new policy about extending the maternity leave for working mothers, and it has the pre-policy rate was about in the 20%, which is about and then after the introduction of the policy, we have seen an increase in the percentage of exclusive breastfeeding for mothers, up to 43% in 2021. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the percentage has kind of plateaued over the last 2 years at 43%. But we, on reflection, we are also aware that this is due to our healthcare workers being pulled to assist with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we had to stop the patient education program on breastfeeding. Fortunately, this has restarted again, and we hope to see an improvement in the rates in the future. But in our second enhanced survey in 2009, we found that 92.2% of babies were breastfed in the first 1 hour of birth. But we also would like to declare that most of our births are in hospitals as well. And in the 2022 report, we found that we have a very good rate of exclusive breastfeeding at 6 weeks of postnatal period, where it's 63% of mothers declared that they still breastfeed exclusively, but obviously that tapered down to 43% at 6 months. I think I would like to touch about the policy that was introduced by the government of Brunei. Previously, before the 1970s, there were no maternity leave recorded for working women. And then in the 1970s, it was 28 days. And in the 1990s, it was increased to 56 days. And then we were lucky in 2011, we managed to increase again our policy to 105 days. In terms of the economy, I think at one stage, because on reflection as well, we realized that we were concentrating on the effect of lengthening the maternity leave and the effect for the exclusive breastfeeding rates. But Brunei, being a small country with about 60% of the women are working, so at that stage we were concentrating on the working women on how they can cope with exclusive breastfeeding. But on reflection again, we haven't looked at the issues on mothers who are not working and their contributions to the economy as well. But we have also noticed an increase in the price of formula milk in the market, which may have contributed to the number of women who prefer to continue with breastfeeding up to 6 months. And also one of the policy that was introduced in 2014 by the government of Brunei was about the building new buildings and requirement policy, where new buildings must provide proper breastfeeding rooms in the country. But in terms of for the future as well, we are actually advocating for paternity leave in terms of to assist the mothers to continue the exclusive breastfeeding and also breastfeeding in general, and also to reach and support the mothers at home. And we are aiming to reach the target of 50% by 2025. If that's our plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rafida. We move on to our question and answer session now. If I could ask all our panelists to come back on and switch your cameras back on so that we can have a quick 10-minute Q&A session. For those of you who'd like to ask questions, please just type in your question in the chat box, and then we will be happy to answer them. Are all our panelists back on? Okay. Are we ready to go? Okay, Julie, this one's for you, Julie. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Julie, there is a tendency for countries to prioritize trade interest over health. And, you know, you're coming from Australia. Australia is one of the bigger exporters of commercial milk formula in the world. What has been the role of exporting countries in this system of marketing?
It's been a shameful role, I have to admit, and certainly NGOs have been trying to highlight the bad behaviour of governments in supporting the formula industry, subsidising the formula industry, providing in countries such as Cambodia, Asia. It's promoted with marketing funding for the industry. It's very shameful, and I'll post in the chat something that I and others have written. I think I can put it in there. I'll post in the Q&A of what we're trying to do to expose it. But actually, if people in other countries raise that issue and bring it to the attention of our governments, that will help too. So don't be shy in telling us where we're going wrong. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julie. We'll go on to Anthony's question in the chat box. This is the Lancet second series on breastfeeding, the first one in 2016. Was there a global assessment done by WHO or UNICEF or even Alive and Thrive as to how countries have responded to and progress in implementation of the 6 action points found in the second paper in the 2016 Lancet series? Why invest and what it will take to improve breastfeeding practices? Who would like to take on this question? Who in our panelists? Paul, perhaps? Do you want to kickstart the answer?
Sure, I can start, and I will volunteer Roland also to chime in. So that we have the Global Breastfeeding Scorecard, which keeps track of key indicators for each country in terms of the overall global breastfeeding targets and specific actions that lead up to or contribute to the achievement of these targets. So I think that would be the one, the first thing that comes to me as a response to Anthony's question. As regard to like a formal research type of assessment, nothing at the top of my head right now, but let's see if I find out more information, I'll let you know, Anthony. But to me, the scorecard will be the first point of contact.
Okay. Does anybody else want to chime in? No. Or
maybe just a quick addition, Mira.
Yeah.
In Southeast in the ASEAN region, there is the ASEAN Food and Nutrition Security Report that was recently published, was supported by UNICEF and spearheaded by ASEAN. So you can also defer to that document to check.
Okay. Our next question from Joe Lamport. Are there efforts being made to integrate the value of breast milk and breastfeeding into food balance sheets? Julie, you want to take this one?
Yes, I think this one's mine.
Yeah.
Yes, there certainly is, and that's part of the intention of the Mother's Milk tool. Of course, Norway has led the world in doing this, and some other countries. I think at one stage, even Philippines was looking at it. I've raised it in Australia, and it has attachment there. Certainly don't feel shy about promoting it. And I would hope that the countries in this region, as they advance their economies, will include mothers in it through recognising that it doesn't actually advance the economy if breastfeeding goes down when women get greater participation and income from market work.
Okay, thank you, Julie. The next question that I have is, breastfeeding is a human rights issue for babies and mothers, and it really should be protected and promoted for the benefit of both. But it appears that breastfeeding has become increasingly seen as a human rights concern of relevance for children, but only minimally for women. How can there be a greater push for the women? I think Brunei has done some bits with maternity leave and all of that. Anybody have any other thoughts as to what else we can actually do to have this as a right for women as well? Anyone?
Perhaps, Mira, if I could come in, I think the issue is even bigger than that. That is what we've been observing as UNICEF, and as many of you know, the rights-based approach is core to our work and very dear to us. That I think there's been a general sliding back of the importance of rights-based approaches, the weight that it carries in many places. For us, it's becoming increasingly difficult to position child rights, women's rights on national agenda. So I think in this region, a larger reckoning needs to be done on how child rights are being considered in development programs, but also in national agendas.
Do you think it has been successful at all, Roland?
I think it's when it started off, I think it's been a very, very powerful tool to advance certain agendas. But I feel it's becoming more and more difficult, as I was describing, to position it.
Okay. Anybody else have thoughts on?
Mira, Yoke-Ling here, maybe I can jump in to add some thoughts. I think this is really one of the reasons why in this 2023 Lancet series, we decided that it would be important to have a paper on the political economy of the industry and to really focus on the need for a lot of structural policies and changes. For example, the step in implementing the WHO code, but it's a minimum standard, and that's quite clearly the stance of ASEAN. It's a minimum standard, it's a starting point. So we need to go further than that. We need to have what has been described in the discussion today, laws around maternity leave. Paternity leave, what Brunei is doing is really very encouraging. And also the way, if we remember, the International Convention on regulating tobacco industries, promotion and marketing, for example, has a very important provision, and that's legally binding, not our code. Our code here is actually voluntary. In the tobacco industry treaty, there is a prohibition of the industry representatives approaching policy and lawmakers. That sort of arm's length kind of thing is very important, and that's what we are calling for in this series. One is to really consider seriously a legally binding instrument to really deal with this industry beyond just marketing, more laws, and also to really keep them at arm's length. We have investigated especially in paper 2, the sophisticated concerted network and strategies of influencing policy making. So if the human rights approach has been sort of pushed back, we don't see as many laws as possible that should be there. And we see at the national level a lot of pressure on governments that try to implement the code. So I think this is what we want and hope that this series will do, not just being papers, but really as a tool for a lot of mobilizing of civil society, working together with the public institutions and government and parliamentarians, and of course the UN agencies and regional level too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yoke-Ling. Anthony has another question. The second paper of this latest series, The Marketing of Commercial Milk Formula, a System to Capture Parents, Communities, Science and Policy, still manifests that pervasive problem on marketing that still persists up to now. Many developed countries have stepped up legislation. Developing countries, I apologize, have their own versions of the code. However, there is a minimal or almost none existing in high-income countries. Would you all agree with me on that one?
Well, I would add that Australia and New Zealand have a self-regulatory system which they say if there are examples of bad marketing behaviour anywhere in Australia's export markets, and tell the Australian government and hold them accountable for it.
Anybody else to add on?
I'll add on a bit, Mira. So I think one of the things we want to highlight, especially in this regional webinar, is that the effects and the disproportionate effect of lack of safeguards against harmful marketing of commercial milk formulas disproportionately felt in Southeast Asia, where the biggest growth market, I believe, now for commercial milk formula sales. So even if, and Anthony's slightly describing it as a universal problem, but I mean, at the end of the day, each country has to legislate and has to adopt the code in the best way possible, as aligned with the international code as possible. But the effects of the marketing is disproportionately felt by low to middle income countries. So let's not forget that.
Okay. Moving on to the next question. So in all of this, after listening to everyone, it would seem like the key to change is having the political will. What do you think would it take for governments to realize the economic benefits of breastfeeding? Zung, what got the government of in Vietnam to actually take those steps to implement Vivid and to curb digital marketing or unethical digital marketing? So, Zung, you want to share some of your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'd like to share several things. I think that the first one is the economic benefits of breastfeeding, and also the involvement and engagement of the breastfeeding mothers community to spread their impact and also raise awareness among for the wider community and put the pressure on the government. But on the other side, I think that we can maximize other incentives of the government. For example, I believe that in Southeast Asia, not only Vietnam, but other countries are developing towards the e-government. It is inevitable given the industry technology revolution, and the government has the incentive to adopt technology application in their work. So we can offer the different technology and to support the government to enforce the code, especially on the digital marketing. And secondly, I think at the same time, we also can raise the companies' social accountable for their compliance, and that is to engage the civil society, the media, in holding the companies accountable for their violations, and based on that we can have to enforce the legal framework that the code has already been adopted in the country level.
Yeah. It's interesting how we're drawing parallels to tobacco companies, isn't it? I always want to say we should implement a sin tax for this and to make it more expensive so that there will be greater awareness for the need to breastfeed. But given the current situation in the world, and we're all talking about inflation and all of that, you are seeing some shift away from commercial milk formula, I'm assuming. Do you think we can use this opportunity to drive home key messages about breastfeeding? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Sorry, Julie, go ahead.
Go ahead, Julie.
Say that in Australia, the industry has managed to keep the consumption tax off not only the infant formulas, but also the toddler milk formulas were not taxed. And I made a submission to the Treasury that they should remove that exemption for the toddler formulas, and they should use the extra revenue to fund breastfeeding programs, and that they would generate huge economic benefits from that, not only in the increased amount of milk that mothers produce when they continue breastfeeding, but also in the health savings for the mother's health and the child's health in the longer term.
Yokley, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, that there is a lot of supporting environment, legal, community, cultural, to enable women to be able to breastfeed. I think the cost of living issue is a broader issue, symptom of a society gone a bit off. You know? But if I'm a working woman and I'm in a precarious job, even if I want to, you know, I can't exercise that option. And I think this is why we want to emphasize the need to very rapidly do all these supporting measures that are needed. And certainly, you know, the aggressive marketing, you know, when it's uncontrolled, it gives such counter messages, such misinformation. So now, we shouldn't stop. And I think some of the discussions today show that there are tools, there are things happening, and there is actually an increase in many countries at the ground level, you know, with supportive government measures. I think we need to, and we see this in the series, I think in paper 1. So there's more going on than we realize. So how do we actually bring those experiences together and ramp up the policy actions and interventions that we need to have, and also the social ones? So I think this really is an all society kind of mobilizing that's needed.
Approach. All right, Roland, you want to add on?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in the short term that COVID has actually led to an increase of violations, as I was describing in my comments. A lot of companies have really preyed on the fears of caretakers related to COVID and potential transmission, and also used donation programs in the context of COVID to push their brands. So I think COVID in a way has helped the promotion of commercial milk formula. Also, a lot of governments, I think, now are in a mindset of deregulation for business in order to support economic activities. And in that climate, it is difficult in many places to make the case for more stringent regulation and more stringent enforcement that will have effects on business.
Paul?
This is also linked to the earlier question on political will. One of the key messages in the series is that economics is the language of parliamentarians and policymakers. So if we want to advocate for policy reform that supports breastfeeding, whether it's paid maternity leave or marketing regulations, it needs to make sense for policymakers from an economic perspective. And that worked very well in Vietnam, as Zoom said. But also, let's not forget, in terms of taxation, there was a very telling slide from paper 3 in Yokling's presentation where the increasing share, the increasing profit of the industry does not translate to increased tax contributions. So what you can interpret that as the high-income dairy producing countries benefiting more, while the low-middle income countries, where the public health benefits are, or consequences rather, are being felt, do not have the benefit of that, the tax contribution. In fact, the tax contribution is going down. So I think these are the types of discussions we should be having as advocates moving forward. I think we cannot continue to argue on the same lines of just health. We need to be, I think, as well-versed as possible on the health and non-health arguments for protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding.
Julie?
Regarding the political commitment, of course, high-level commitment is crucially important, but the experience of COVID reminds us that we also need that commitment at the health system level. And in so many countries in Australia and in Asian countries, I know in Indonesia, I know in China, during COVID, the health system failed to support breastfeeding. They failed to support mothers to birth the way they wanted to. They mandated caesareans, they mandated inductions, they separated the mothers and the babies. So that political commitment also has to come from within the health system. And in fact, during COVID, it was the mothers' organisations, it was the NGOs that were left to lobby and argue for the individual facilities to say, this is wrong, this is not what WHO is saying. Now, why wasn't it the government health departments that instantly, at the beginning of COVID, communicated the WHO recommendations about the interim guidance about mothers and new mothers? We really let mothers down in that case, and it was political commitment from the top right the way down through the health system.
Dr. Rafida, would you like to share your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, the political commitment is very, very important in terms of for exclusive breastfeeding. But then, we have to also look at in terms of the returns for the country as well. That's why when we introduced the extended maternity leave, which is still argued not enough, 105 days when compared to other countries. But during COVID, yes, we do admit, because again, I think in Brunei, if I were to defend it, why our breastfeeding rate hasn't increased, although it hasn't decreased over the last 2 years, was that I think we need to plan more we need to plan in terms of not just government commitments, but also commitments from everyone in the country. And we were expecting, our expectations from MySyn was that the breastfeeding rate would have gone up because lots of women were working from home, but statistics doesn't show us that. So that is something that needs to be further explored. I mean, why this has happened. We put it down as to our support, but there could be other factors as well. And in terms of our worries, is about the advertisements as well. Our worry is for those who are in the lower socioeconomic class, where is the belief about the advertisements and about the things that they receive via social media as well, compared to the information or education packages that they receive from the health system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rafida. Luz, would you like to end the session and just share your thoughts very quickly?
Yes, in the Philippines, we have seen the impact of extended maternity leave, because the duration of exclusive breastfeeding has increased from 2 months to 4 months, and even up to 5 months. And we have seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic, since most mothers are working from home, and because also of some restrictions and less access to going to groceries and other outlets to get the breast milk substitute, coupled with our strong support to mothers, to breastfeeding mothers, informing them that even if you have COVID-19, there's a little possibility that you will transmit the virus to the child through your breast milk. We have seen, and it has been proven by our National Nutrition Survey, that indeed the rate of exclusive breastfeeding has increased in the country. But of course, we also use the social media in calling out people asking for donation for breast milk substitute. This was rampant also during the COVID-19, and Roland is correct that some milk industry has really used the pandemic as a way also promoting their products and their brands. So, but we use also the same social media to be able to inform people that they do not have to subscribe to the milk formula, and also the local government units not to really call for donations. We know that they have the best intention, but this is going to be harmful rather than useful to our mothers and children. So we've seen an improvement, but of course, this has to be continued, and there should be more efforts really to enforce our code, and yes, to educate our healthcare providers that indeed we need to protect our mothers and children.
Thank you. Thank you, Luz. And that brings us to the end of the Q&A session. And to close today's event, please welcome Julia Wati Untoro, Technical Lead for Nutrition from the WHO Regional Office for the Western Pacific region. Julia.
Thank you so much, Mira. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our webinar after a very stimulating and rich presentation and discussion, which emphasized how the value of breastfeeding has been undermined, that the commercial milk formula sales tactic violate the International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitute. We learned today that the vulnerability of women and children are exploited by the commercial milk formula industry. We commend the member state of the ASEAN on their commitment and also call the government to strengthen the regulation of the irresponsible marketing of baby formula and the widespread industry interference. Indeed, the time is now for radical transformation to build the resilience of breastfeeding. Women should be empowered to make choices of infant feeding, which are informed by accurate information free from industry influence. It is our collective responsibility to protect our youngest. I wish to thank all our speakers and moderator whose present has been invaluable and the organizer that making this launch in Southeast Asia a success. Thank you so very much for all your participation to this event. We hope you enjoyed and inspired by the presentation and the discussion. Thank you for your time. Over to you, Mira.
Thank you very much, Dr. Julia. Ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of today's forum and discussion on the 2023 Lancet Breastfeeding series. The full series has been published and you can access it on the link displayed on the slide. Once again, we thank you, all our speakers, our authors, our discussants, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you all and have a good day.